They laughed when the quiet veteran paid $20 for a collapsing cabin on the mountain. But months later, when the worst blizzard in decades buried their town, the only thing standing between them and death was the man they mocked and the German shepherd who never left his side. High above the fading mining town of Silver Creek, Montana, a ruined cabin stood beside a narrow mountain stream that never stopped moving. And most people believed the place was nothing more than rotting wood and broken stone. But Daniel Carter, a silent veteran with tired eyes, saw something different. He saw preparation, survival, and a second chance. The townspeople laughed when he bought it. They thought he was a man hiding from the world. They had no idea that one winter storm would soon prove them wrong. Before we begin the story, tell me something simple in the comments. Where are you watching this video from today? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. The last auction in Silver Creek felt less like a sale and more like a farewell. Men stood in small circles outside the old freight warehouse, their boots crunching over frozen gravel while the bitterroot wind moved through the valley like something restless and tired. Wagons creaked. Horses stamped their hooves. The sky hung low and pale over the mountains, promising snow that would not wait for anyone. For 50 years, Silver Creek had been a copper town. Now the copper was gone. The Monarch Ridge mine had closed 6 months earlier after the last profitable seam ran dry. Investors back east packed their ledgers and vanished. The machinery had been stripped and sold piece by piece. Families who had built their lives around the mine were leaving one wagon at a time. The auction was the final act. Inside the yard, a thin man in a brown coat stood atop a wooden crate, reading off items from a paper that fluttered in the wind. Mining carts, 2 remaining, starting bid $20. A few hands rose. The carts went quickly. 3 draft horses, aged but sound. Those went too. Even cracked lanterns, broken shovels, and rusted chains found buyers. In a dying town, anything that still had a use was worth something. But by the time the auctioneer reached the final line on his paper, the crowd had thinned, and people were tired of buying pieces of a place they were about to abandon. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Last item," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "One hillside cabin on North Creek Road. Structure sold as is. No guarantees. Land included." A murmur moved through the crowd. Everyone knew that cabin. It sat half a mile above town where the trees began to climb into the mountains. The roof sagged. One wall leaned like it was tired of standing. Yes, the porch had collapsed years ago during a heavy winter storm. The small stream running beside it was the only thing still alive up there. No one had lived in that cabin for nearly a decade. The auctioneer waited. Silence. A man near the back laughed quietly. "You'd freeze to death in that place before Thanksgiving." Another voice answered, "Roof won't even make it through the first snow." The auctioneer glanced at the paper again, as if hoping he had missed something. "Oh, starting bid? $20? No one moved. A wagon creaked somewhere behind the crowd as a family prepared to leave town before nightfall. The wind rattled loose boards on the warehouse wall. The auctioneer sighed. "All right then. 20. The voice was calm, steady, and close enough that everyone turned. The man who had spoken stood near the back fence. He wore a faded military jacket the color of old pine bark and a wool cap pulled low over dark hair streaked with gray. Yet his face carried the quiet weathering of someone who had spent years outdoors. Lines had settled around his eyes in a way that suggested more sleepless nights than laughter. At his side sat a large German shepherd. The dog was still as carved stone, thick fur rippling slightly in the cold wind. His amber eyes watched the crowd with an alert calm that made several men shift their feet. The auctioneer squinted at the bidder. Name? Daniel Carter. The name drifted through the yard like a small stone dropped into water. People knew him. Daniel had come to Silver Creek 2 years earlier, sometime after the war. No one was entirely sure where from. He worked odd jobs when they appeared, repairing fences, hauling lumber, fixing broken generators, but he kept mostly to himself. What people did know was that he had once been a soldier, and that the dog never left his side. A laugh broke from the crowd. "Oh, you serious, Carter?" Frank Doyle, the owner of the saloon, leaned against a wagon wheel with a grin spreading across his broad face. "That place ain't a cabin," Frank called out. "It's a coffin with windows." Several men chuckled. Daniel didn't answer. The German shepherd turned his head slowly toward the laughter. His ears lifted slightly, but he made no sound. The silence stretched long enough that the auctioneer cleared his throat again. "Do I hear 25? Nothing. But most of the town had already decided that Silver Creek's future was somewhere else. No one was interested in buying ruins on a mountain they were about to leave behind. Frank raised his voice again. "Hey, Carter," he said, "you planning to live up there alone with that dog? Winter's coming." Another man added, "Better dig the grave before the snow hits." More laughter rolled through the yard. Daniel's face didn't change. He simply stood with his hand tucked into the pockets of his jacket, and as if the cold wind moving down from the mountains barely touched him. The dog beside him, Shadow, remained seated, eyes moving slowly from one voice to another. The auctioneer shrugged. "Well," he said, raising the small wooden hammer in his hand. $20 going once?" The wind pushed harder through the valley, carrying the faint smell of pine and snow. "Going twice?" No one spoke. The hammer dropped against the crate. "Sold." The sound echoed softly through the yard. "Oh, cabin on North Creek Road," the auctioneer announced, scribbling on his paper. "To Daniel Carter." The laughter came again, louder now that the decision was final. Frank Doyle shook his head. "Man just bought himself a grave." Daniel walked forward to collect the folded deed. Shadow rose beside him, moving with the quiet precision of an animal that had spent years watching for danger. As Daniel took the paper from the auctioneer, the dog stood close enough that his shoulder brushed the man's leg. Up close, the auctioneer noticed the faint scar running along Daniel's left temple. "Cabin's in rough shape," the man said carefully. Daniel nodded once. "I've seen worse." The auctioneer didn't ask what that meant. Daniel folded the paper and slid it inside his jacket. Then he turned and walked back toward the road. Shadow followed at his heel. Behind them, the crowd slowly broke apart as wagons rolled toward the main road out of town. Frank Doyle watched Daniel and the dog disappear past the last row of empty houses. He spat into the dust. "That fool won't last a month up there." But Daniel Carter never looked back. High above Silver Creek, where the narrow stream curved between frozen stones and the mountains leaned close enough to silence the wind, the ruined cabin waited, and somewhere in the quiet forest beyond it, the first snow of winter had already begun to fall. Daniel Carter reached the place just before dusk. The trail climbing from town was little more than a narrow dirt path that wound through pine and granite. Fallen needles muffled the sound of footsteps, and the air smelled of cold water and resin. Shadow moved ahead of him, pausing every few yards to scan the tree line before continuing. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, it looked even worse than the stories in town had suggested. One corner of the roof sagged under the weight of years of storms. The front porch had collapsed into a crooked pile of gray boards. The windows were cracked or missing entirely, leaving dark gaps that stared out over the valley like hollow eyes. The stream beside the cabin ran clear and steady, its water slipping over stone with a quiet, constant sound. Daniel stood there for a long moment, studying everything. Shadow circled the cabin once, nose close to the ground, reading the scents of the forest like a book. Deer had passed recently. A raccoon had climbed the porch beams days ago. Somewhere farther uphill, the faint smell of bear lingered. The dog returned to Daniel's side and sat. Daniel stepped forward and pushed open what remained of the cabin door. It groaned against the warped frame before giving way. Inside, the cold had settled deep into the wood. Dust hung in the air, while a rusted stove leaned crooked in the corner. Broken planks covered parts of the floor where boards had rotted through. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls and moved slowly across the room. Daniel walked through it all without speaking. He set down the small canvas pack he had carried from town and pulled a lantern from inside. A match flared briefly, casting warm light across the rough walls. Shadow padded in after him and immediately moved to the doorway again, and sitting with his back against the frame, as if guarding the entrance. Daniel noticed that. "You never stop working, do you?" he murmured. Shadow's ears twitched, but the dog stayed where he was. Outside, the last light faded behind the bitterroot peaks. Daniel began moving through the cabin methodically. He examined the stove first, tapping the metal with his knuckle. Rusted, but solid. The pipe would need replacing. He ran his hand along the wall beams. The lower logs were weathered, but not rotten. The roof was the real problem. Through a long split above the main room, he could see the first flakes of snow drifting down from the darkening sky. Daniel climbed onto a chair and pressed against the beam. It held, though barely. "Good bones," he said quietly. Shadow watched him, head tilted. Daniel stepped down and moved toward the back corner, where an old wooden cot still stood. The mattress had long since turned to dust, but the frame remained. He set his pack beside it and began unpacking the few things he owned. A rolled blanket, a tin cup, a small field radio that rarely found a signal in the mountains, and a worn military medical kit, edges softened by years of use. The lantern light flickered across the room as the wind picked up outside. By the time Daniel finished unpacking, darkness had settled fully across the valley. From the open doorway, Silver Creek's scattered lights could be seen far below, tiny, uncertain sparks against the vast black of the mountains. Most of them would be gone soon. Daniel stepped outside. Shadow rose immediately and followed. The cold had sharpened, the kind that bit into the lungs with each breath. Snow drifted quietly through the trees, catching faint moonlight as it fell. Daniel crouched beside the stream and watched the water move. Even now, with winter arriving, it ran steady and strong. Now the sound reminded him of something older than the town below, something that would remain long after the last truck left Silver Creek. Shadow lowered himself beside Daniel, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. For a while, neither of them moved. Then the dog's ears lifted sharply. Shadow stood. A low rumble rolled deep in his chest. Daniel didn't turn. "What is it?" Shadow took 3 slow steps toward the forest. Daniel followed his gaze. The trees were still, their tall trunks black against the thin wash of moonlight. But somewhere uphill, something large moved quietly through the brush. Branches shifted. Snow slipped from a limb. Daniel remained perfectly still. Shadow's growl deepened. After a moment, the sound in the woods faded. Whatever had been watching decided to move on. Shadow stayed tense for several seconds longer before finally returning to Daniel's side. "Not the only ones up here," Daniel said softly. And he rose and walked back toward the cabin. Inside, the wind had begun pushing snow through the broken roof. Daniel set the lantern on the floor and pulled a hammer from his pack. Outside, he gathered several loose boards from the collapsed porch and carried them inside. Shadow followed every step, never straying far. For the next hour, the only sounds inside the cabin were the steady rhythm of hammering and the quiet rush of the stream outside. Daniel patched the worst gaps in the roof, sealing them just enough to keep the snow from falling directly into the room. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold for now. By the time he finished, the lantern had burned low. Daniel sat on the edge of the cot and rubbed his hands together slowly. Shadow moved closer and lay down beside him. For a few minutes, the cabin was silent except for the wind. Then Daniel lay back against the rough boards of the cot and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. The dream arrived the way it always did, without warning. Dark sky, sand, the thunder of something exploding far too close. Daniel's eyes snapped open. For a moment he didn't know where he was. His hand had already reached under the blanket, fingers tightening around the handle of the old combat knife he kept there. His breathing was fast, shallow. Then he heard it. Water. The steady sound of the stream beside the cabin. The cold mountain air. The wind in the pines, in Silver Creek far below. Slowly, Daniel's breathing steadied. Shadow had already moved. The dog stood beside the cot, nose pressed gently against Daniel's arm. Daniel exhaled. "Easy," he murmured, the word barely louder than the wind. Shadow remained there until the tension left Daniel's shoulders. Only then did the dog settle down again beside the cot. Outside, snow continued to fall quietly across the mountains, and far below in Silver Creek. And another wagon rolled out of town under the dim yellow light of a street lamp. But high above the valley, in the ruined cabin beside the cold running stream, Daniel Carter stayed. Morning came slowly in the Bitterroot Mountains. The sky turned pale gray behind the pine trees, and the cold light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Frost clung to the inside of the window frame, tracing thin white veins across the old glass. Daniel Carter was already awake, and he had been awake for hours. Shadow lifted his head from the floor as Daniel stepped outside. The snow that had fallen during the night now covered the ground in a thin, clean layer that reflected the first light of morning. The stream beside the cabin still ran strong, slipping between dark stones without hesitation. Daniel stood for a moment, breathing in the cold air. The mountains were quiet in a way towns never were. No engines, no voices, only wind and water. Shadow stepped out beside him, stretching once before trotting toward the tree line to check the surroundings. His nose stayed low to the snow, following invisible trails left during the night. Daniel turned his attention back to the cabin. It would not survive the winter the way it stood. Not without work. He walked slowly around the structure, studying every beam, every crack in the wood. The rear wall leaned slightly downhill. The roof sagged near the chimney. The porch had collapsed entirely, leaving broken boards scattered across the slope. But the foundation was still strong. That mattered. Daniel picked up one of the loose boards from the porch and tested its weight in his hands. Usable. He carried it toward the cabin wall and leaned it against the siding. Shadow returned a few minutes later, snow clinging to his paws. The dog sat down nearby and watched Daniel begin his work. Hammer strikes echoed softly through the trees. By midday, Daniel had cleared the broken remains of the porch and stacked the boards in a neat pile beside the cabin. He used the straightest pieces to reinforce the door frame, driving old nails back into place with steady, deliberate swings. Shadow moved around him like a silent assistant, sometimes disappearing into the trees, sometimes returning to sit quietly and observe. Far below in Silver Creek, the morning crowd gathered inside Doyle's saloon. The building was warmer than most places in town, and the coffee was strong enough to wake even the most exhausted miner. Frank Doyle leaned on the bar as he wiped down a glass. "Anybody see Carter this morning?" he asked. A man sitting near the window chuckled. "Probably froze solid up in that shack." Another voice joined in. "I heard the roof's half gone." Frank grinned. "Well, if the snow doesn't finish him off, the bears will." The room filled with quiet laughter. Across the street, Emily Harper stood behind the counter of her small grocery store, organizing sacks of flour onto a wooden shelf. She heard the laughter drifting from the saloon through the thin walls. Emily glanced out the window toward the mountains. The cabin Daniel had bought couldn't be seen from town, but she knew exactly where it stood. High above North Creek Road. She remembered the look on Daniel's face at the auction. Not stubborn, not foolish, determined. And Emily picked up a small crate of nails and set it near the door, just in case. Up in the mountains, Daniel's work continued. By late afternoon, the broken doorway had been reinforced, and a new beam supported the sagging roof corner. It wasn't perfect, but the cabin stood straighter than it had the day before. Daniel stepped back and studied the structure. Shadow sat beside the stream, ears lifted. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. The water moved steadily around a bend about 20 yards upstream. There, the current narrowed slightly between two rock outcrops before widening again near the cabin. Daniel walked toward it. Shadow rose and followed. At the bend in the stream, Daniel crouched down and studied the flow of water. Even with early winter beginning, the current ran strong. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and began sketching rough lines across the page. A channel here, a wheel there. Now Shadow stood beside him, watching the forest behind them. Daniel glanced up at the trees once before returning to his drawing. "Good drop," he murmured. The stream fell nearly 3 feet between the rocks before leveling out again. Enough to turn a wheel, enough to power something. Shadow's ears suddenly turned toward the trail leading down the mountain. Daniel closed the notebook. Footsteps approached through the snow. A moment later, a thin teenage boy appeared between the trees, and he stopped when he saw Daniel. The boy looked about 14, maybe 15. His coat was too thin for the mountain cold, and his boots carried the dust of Silver Creek's streets. Shadow stepped forward. The dog didn't bark, but his presence alone was enough to make the boy hesitate. "It's okay," Daniel said calmly. Shadow stopped. The boy swallowed. I wasn't sneaking or anything," he said quickly. Daniel nodded. "Name?" "Lucas. Lucas Bennett." The boy looked around at the half-repaired cabin. "They said you were crazy," Lucas added. Daniel returned to the stream bank and picked up a rock, studying its shape before setting it back down. "People say a lot of things." Lucas stepped closer. "You really gonna live here?" "Yes." "Through winter?" Daniel looked up at the snow-covered mountains. "That's the plan." Lucas stared at the stream. "What are you building?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the bend in the water. "See how the current narrows there?" Lucas nodded. "If you guide that flow," Daniel continued, "you can make the water do the work." Lucas frowned slightly. "What kind of work?" Daniel closed his notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. "You'll see." Shadow returned to Daniel's side, sitting quietly as if approving the conversation. Lucas studied the dog. "What's his name?" "Shadow." Lucas crouched slightly. "Oh, can I—" Shadow's ears twitched. Daniel gave a small nod. Lucas held out his hand. Shadow leaned forward and sniffed it once before stepping back again. "He's smart," Lucas said. Daniel allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "Yes." The sun was already beginning to sink behind the mountains when Lucas finally turned toward the trail. "My mom says we're leaving town soon," he said. Daniel didn't answer. Lucas looked back once more. "You're really staying?" Daniel glanced toward the stream again. "Yes." Lucas nodded slowly before heading down the trail. Shadow watched until the boy disappeared among the trees. Night settled over the mountains again. Inside the cabin, the lantern burned softly while Daniel studied his notebook. Outside, the stream moved endlessly through the dark forest, and somewhere down in Silver Creek, the laughter about the man on the mountain continued. High above the valley, the mountains did not laugh. They watched. The first true cold of winter arrived a few days later. Morning frost thickened across the ground, and the air carried that sharp metallic edge that came just before snow began to stay instead of melt. Daniel Carter worked through it all. By the time the sun rose each day, he was already outside, hammer in hand or shovel cutting into the frozen soil. The broken porch had been cleared away entirely now. In its place, Daniel began setting new support posts made from straight pine trunks he cut farther up the slope. Shadow never strayed far. While Daniel worked, the dog patrolled the clearing in slow circles, moving between the cabin and the trees like a silent guard. His nose lifted often, testing the wind for scents drifting down from the mountains. Sometimes Daniel would pause and glance toward the dog. If Shadow stood still with his ears high, Daniel waited. If Shadow relaxed again, and Daniel continued working. The system between them required no words. One afternoon, Daniel was balancing on a ladder against the roof, replacing a section of rotten boards when Shadow suddenly froze near the tree line. The dog's posture changed instantly. His back straightened. His ears snapped forward. Then came the low growl. It rolled from deep inside Shadow's chest. Quiet but unmistakable. Daniel stopped hammering. He stayed still on the ladder for a moment, listening. The forest looked peaceful enough. Pine branches swayed gently in the cold breeze. Sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden beams. But Shadow had not moved. The growl deepened. Daniel climbed down slowly. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the dark spaces between the trees uphill. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then something large shifted behind a cluster of pine trunks. A black shape, heavy, slow. A black bear stepped into view. The animal was broad and thick through the shoulders, its winter coat already growing dense. It had likely been drawn by the smell of food scraps Daniel had burned behind the cabin the night before. The bear stopped when it saw the man and the dog. For several seconds, no one moved. Daniel knew better than to run. Shadow took one careful step forward. The growl became louder. The bear lifted its head slightly, sniffing the air. Then it took a step closer. Daniel felt the familiar calm that had once carried him through far more dangerous places than this mountain clearing. His mind moved through possibilities quickly. Distance to the cabin. Distance to the axe leaning against the wall. Wind direction. Shadow stepped forward again. The dog's body lowered slightly, weight shifting to his front legs. The bear took another step. Then Shadow barked. The sound cracked through the clearing like a rifle shot. Sharp, explosive. But the bear jerked backward in surprise. Shadow charged forward 2 steps, barking again with fierce intensity. Daniel didn't shout. He simply moved slowly toward the cabin wall and picked up the axe. The bear watched the dog carefully now. Shadow didn't retreat. His bark echoed again, deep and powerful for a dog his size. The bear swung its head once, clearly reconsidering the situation. Another bark, another step forward. Finally the bear turned. It didn't run. But it moved steadily back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows of the forest as quietly as it had arrived. The clearing fell silent again. Daniel lowered the axe. Shadow remained tense for several seconds, staring into the woods until the last sound of the bear's movement faded. Only then did the dog return to Daniel's side. Daniel crouched beside him. "Good call," he said quietly. Shadow's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Daniel reached out and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Saved us some trouble." But the moment of calm didn't last long. Shadow suddenly turned again. Another sound had entered the clearing. Branches snapping. Heavier this time. The bear had not left. Instead, it circled. Daniel stood. The black shape burst from the trees again. Closer now. The bear charged toward the cabin, perhaps deciding the strange pair guarding the clearing were not enough reason to abandon an easy meal. Oh, Shadow reacted instantly. The dog lunged forward with a roar of barking fury, placing himself directly between the bear and Daniel. The bear swiped, its paw cut through the air with terrifying speed. Shadow dodged, but not completely. The claws raked across his shoulder. The dog yelped once but didn't retreat. Instead, he barked again and darted sideways, drawing the bear's attention away from Daniel. Daniel moved fast, while the axe swung downward into the ground beside the bear's path with a heavy crack. The sudden impact startled the animal just enough to interrupt its charge. Shadow barked again. The bear hesitated. Two threats now. Man, dog. Not worth the risk. With a frustrated grunt, the bear finally turned for good and lumbered back into the trees. Silence returned slowly. Daniel dropped the axe and knelt beside Shadow. The dog stood stiffly, breathing hard. A dark line of blood had begun to soak through the fur along his shoulder. Daniel's voice softened. Easy, soldier. Shadow tried to wag his tail once, but the motion stopped halfway. Daniel led him inside the cabin. The lantern lit the small room with warm golden light as Daniel opened the old medical kit he had carried since the war. He cleaned the wound carefully, rinsing it with bottled water before pressing a folded bandage against the cut. Shadow stayed still the entire time. Only the faint tightening around his eyes showed the pain. Daniel worked with quiet focus, hands steady from years of doing the same work under far worse conditions. When the bandage was secure, Daniel sat back on the cot. Shadow rested his head against Daniel's knee. For a while, neither of them moved. Outside, evening settled over the Bitterroot Mountains. The stream continued its endless song beside the cabin. Far below, and Silver Creek's lights flickered on one by one as darkness spread across the valley. And in the quiet cabin above it all, Daniel Carter finally allowed himself a tired breath. Guess we're both staying, he murmured. Shadow closed his eyes, but even as the dog rested, one ear remained turned toward the forest. Because in the mountains above Silver Creek, danger rarely came only once. Morning came cold and pale over the Bitterroot Range. All the storm clouds that had brushed the peaks during the night drifted east, leaving the sky clear and hard like polished glass. Frost clung to every pine needle, turning the forest silver in the early light. Inside the cabin, the lantern had burned low. Daniel Carter sat on the edge of the cot, tying a fresh bandage around Shadow's shoulder. The wound from the bear's claws had been deep but clean. Daniel had stitched worse injuries in darker places many years before, and under far worse circumstances. Even so, he checked the bandage again, tightening the cloth just enough to keep pressure on the cut. Shadow remained still through it all. The German shepherd watched Daniel with calm amber eyes, his breathing steady despite the pain. Hold still, Daniel murmured. The dog didn't move. When Daniel finished, he leaned back slightly and studied the wound. It'll heal, he said quietly. Shadow blinked once. Outside, the stream moved steadily beside the cabin, with the sound of water slipping over stone echoing softly through the clearing. Daniel stood and stepped outside. The cold air bit into his lungs immediately. The mountains stretched around him in every direction, quiet and immense. Snow clung to the higher ridges now, white against the dark rock. Daniel walked down toward the stream. Shadow followed, limping slightly, but refusing to stay behind. At the bend in the water where Daniel had studied the current before, and he crouched again and looked carefully at the flow. The stream narrowed sharply between two granite outcrops before widening again below the cabin. Daniel picked up a stick and pushed it into the water. The current carried it quickly downstream. Strong, reliable. He took the notebook from his jacket and opened it. Rough sketches filled the pages now, lines of wood beams, angles, flow channels. the shape of a wheel. Shadow lowered himself onto the snow beside him, just watching quietly while Daniel drew another line across the paper. "A little dam here," Daniel said under his breath. The pencil scratched across the page. "And a channel cut through there." The stream continued its steady rush. Daniel closed the notebook. Work began that same morning. He started by gathering stones. The mountains provided plenty of them. Flat rocks along the stream bank and larger pieces scattered across the slope. One by one, when Daniel hauled them toward the narrow point in the water where the granite walls tightened the flow. Shadow lay nearby, occasionally rising to patrol the tree line before returning to his place beside the growing pile of stone. By midday, a small wall had begun to take shape. Daniel wedged the rocks together carefully, building them up across part of the stream to guide the current toward one side. The water resisted at first, unswirling angrily around the new barrier, before finally bending toward the narrow channel he left open. Daniel stepped back, studying the movement. "Almost," he murmured. Shadow tilted his head. Daniel adjusted 2 more stones. The water shifted again. Now it rushed harder through the gap. Daniel nodded slightly. "That'll do." The sound of the hammer echoed again through the forest that afternoon. But Daniel was not repairing the cabin this time. Instead, he worked beside it. While using pine logs cut from farther up the slope, he began building a frame beside the channel he had carved. The beams were rough but sturdy, lashed together with heavy bolts Daniel had salvaged from an abandoned mining shed weeks earlier. Shadow watched from the shade of a nearby pine. Occasionally the dog stood and limped closer, inspecting Daniel's progress with careful interest. By the time the sun dipped behind the western ridges, the skeleton of a structure had appeared beside the stream. 2 vertical supports, a crossbeam, and between them, an empty space where something large would soon turn. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. Shadow approached and sat beside him. Daniel glanced down at the dog. "What do you think?" Shadow wagged his tail once. Down in Silver Creek, the laughter had not yet stopped. Inside Doyle's saloon, the morning crowd had grown thicker, and Frank Doyle leaned across the bar while pouring coffee for 2 miners preparing to leave town the next day. "You hear what Carter's doing now?" one of the men asked. Frank snorted. "Let me guess. Fixing that broken shack." "Not exactly," the man replied. "Kid Bennett says he's building some kind of contraption by the creek." Frank laughed loudly. "A contraption?" "Water wheel, maybe." The bar erupted with amusement. "A water wheel?" someone shouted from the back. What's he planning to power? A flour mill?" Frank shook his head. "Man spent too long in the army," he said. "War does strange things to a person." Across the street, Emily Harper stood in the doorway of her store, watching the mountains. Lucas Bennett had stopped by earlier that morning to buy bread for his mother. The boy had talked quickly, words tumbling over each other as he described the work Daniel was doing beside the stream. Emily listened carefully. "A wheel?" she had asked, as Lucas nodded. "Yeah, big one." Now Emily stared toward the slopes above Silver Creek, where the forest hid Daniel's cabin from view. She folded her arms against the cold wind. "Maybe he knows something the rest of us don't," she murmured. Back in the mountains, Daniel worked until the last light faded. The frame beside the stream was nearly complete now. Tomorrow, he would begin carving the wheel itself. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, while watching the forest as night settled once more across the Bitterroot Mountains. The dog's ears twitched at every distant sound, because while Daniel Carter built his quiet machine beside the rushing water, Shadow knew the mountains were still watching, and winter had only just begun. The first heavy snow came 3 days later. It arrived quietly at first, drifting down through the tall pines like pale dust. And by morning, the clearing around Daniel's cabin was buried under nearly a foot of fresh powder, and the mountains above Silver Creek had turned completely white. The stream still ran strong. Daniel stood beside it with his coat collar pulled high against the cold wind, studying the frame he had built beside the channel. Over the past 2 days, he had finished shaping the water wheel from thick pine planks, carving each paddle by hand and fitting them carefully into the wooden hub. But now the wheel rested inside the frame, its lower paddles dipping into the current. Daniel pushed it once. The wheel creaked. Then it turned slowly as the water caught the first paddle. Shadow sat nearby watching the movement, his bandaged shoulder already beginning to heal. The wheel completed one full turn, then another. Daniel allowed himself a small nod. "Good," he murmured. The system wasn't perfect yet. The channel guiding the water needed more stone reinforcement, and the axle still needed to be tightened, but the principle worked. The stream had begun doing the work. That afternoon, Lucas Bennett climbed the trail again, his boots kicking through the deep snow. When he reached the clearing, he stopped in amazement. Whoa! The water wheel turned steadily beside the cabin, its paddles dipping into the fast-moving current. Daniel stood beside it with a wrench in his hand. Lucas approached slowly. You actually built it." Daniel didn't look up from the axle. "Looks that way." Lucas walked closer, staring at the spinning wheel. "What's it for?" Daniel tightened the last bolt and stepped back. "For now, cutting lumber." Lucas frowned. "You mean like a sawmill?" Daniel nodded toward a wooden platform beside the cabin where a long steel blade lay waiting. "Eventually." Lucas looked impressed. Shadow stood and approached the boy, sniffing him once before settling beside Daniel again. Lucas reached down to scratch behind the dog's ear. "He's tough," the boy said. "Most dogs would have stayed in bed after a bear claw." Shadow blinked slowly. The day passed quietly after that. Lucas helped Daniel carry more stones to reinforce the channel, while the water wheel turned steadily beside them. The mountains remained calm, the sky clear, the cold sharp but manageable. But by evening, the wind began to change. The clouds rolled in from the west, dark and heavy. Daniel noticed immediately. Storm. He had seen enough of them in the mountains already to recognize the signs. By sunset, the first drops of freezing rain struck the roof of the cabin. Lucas looked toward the sky. "Think I should head back to town?" Daniel nodded. "Better go now." Lucas grabbed his coat and hurried down the trail before darkness settled in. Shadow watched him disappear among the trees. The wind rose steadily after that. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full force. Rain hammered the roof of the cabin, mixing with snow that whipped through the clearing in sharp bursts. The stream beside the house roared louder now, swollen with runoff from the mountains above. Daniel stood by the window watching the water level climb. Shadow paced near the door. The dog's unease grew with every passing minute. Around midnight, the first real problem appeared. A heavy crack echoed somewhere upstream. Shadow's head snapped toward the sound. The dog barked once. Daniel grabbed the lantern and stepped outside into the storm. Rain stung his face immediately. The stream had changed. What had been a steady mountain current that morning was now a rushing torrent, choked with branches and debris swept down from higher elevations. Daniel moved closer to the channel. Then he saw it. A fallen pine trunk had been carried downstream by the floodwater. Once it slammed into the stone barrier Daniel had built earlier that week and wedged itself against the narrow gap guiding water toward the wheel. The current pushed hard against the trapped log, harder every second. If the trunk shifted sideways, it could rip apart the entire stone wall and take the wheel with it. Shadow barked sharply. Daniel knew the risk immediately. If the wall broke, the flood would tear through the channel and smash the wheel against the cabin foundation. Weeks of work would vanish in seconds. Daniel grabbed a rope from the cabin wall and ran toward the stream. The water was already spilling over the stones now, ice cold and violent. Shadow followed without hesitation. Daniel waded into the edge of the current, bracing himself against the force. The water climbed to his knees instantly. He looped the rope around the thick trunk of the fallen pine. "Hold steady," he muttered. Shadow stood on the bank, was barking into the storm, as if trying to push the river itself back. Daniel pulled the rope tight and anchored the other end around a thick support beam of the water wheel frame. Then he shoved against the log with everything he had. The trunk shifted slightly, but the current shoved it right back. Daniel tried again. The log moved an inch, then two. Shadow barked louder. Another surge of water slammed into the barrier. The trunk lurched violently. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the entire stone wall might collapse. Daniel dug his boots into the riverbed and shoved with every ounce of strength left in his body. "Come on!" The log suddenly rolled sideways. Freed from the narrow gap, the raging current seized it instantly and dragged it downstream. The water slammed hard against the stones one last time. But the wall held. Daniel staggered back onto the bank, breathing hard. Shadow ran forward and pressed against him, soaking wet from the rain. Daniel dropped to one knee and wrapped an arm around the dog. "Still standing," he said quietly. Behind them, the water wheel continued turning. Slowly, steadily. The storm raged for hours after that, but when dawn finally arrived over the Bitterroot Mountains, the cabin still stood. The wheel still turned, and the stream continued its endless work. Far below in Silver Creek, the people in town would soon hear the story. But the man on the mountain and his dog had already gone back to work. Because winter was not finished yet, not even close. The storm that followed arrived 2 weeks later. At first it looked like any other mountain snowfall. Gray clouds rolled slowly over the Bitterroot peaks, and a quiet curtain of flakes drifted down through the tall pines surrounding Daniel Carter's cabin. But the air felt different. He noticed it before the snow even reached the ground. The cold had teeth. Shadow noticed it too. The German shepherd stood near the edge of the clearing that morning, nose lifted into the wind. His ears turned slightly, as if the mountains themselves were whispering something only he could hear. Daniel stepped outside carrying an armload of freshly cut boards. The water wheel beside the stream turned steadily now, its paddles dipping into the current with a deep, steady rhythm. Each rotation drove the rough wooden mechanism Daniel had built beside the cabin, and a long metal blade, salvaged from an abandoned mining sawmill, moved slowly back and forth across the cutting platform. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Daniel stacked the boards beside the cabin wall and paused to study the sky. The clouds were thicker now, low, heavy. He wiped his hands on his coat and looked toward the valley far below. Silver Creek sat quiet beneath the gray sky, smoke rising from only a few chimneys now. Half the town had already left. As the ones who remained were mostly families who couldn't afford the long journey to another place. Daniel knew what storms like this could do. He had seen mountains bury entire roads overnight. Behind him, Shadow let out a low, warning bark. Daniel turned. The wind shifted suddenly, pushing through the clearing with a sharp howl. Snow thickened instantly. By afternoon, the storm had become something else entirely. The sky vanished. Snow whipped sideways through the trees, but piling against the cabin walls and drifting over the stream banks. The water wheel still turned, but now ice began forming along its edges. Daniel worked quickly, packing straw around the channel to keep the flow from freezing solid. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. Shadow stayed close beside him, watching the forest with alert eyes. The storm grew worse. By sunset, the wind roared through the mountains like a living thing. Snow buried the clearing, swallowing the path leading down toward Silver Creek. Daniel finally stepped back inside the cabin and shut the door against the gale. The lantern light flickered as the wind shook the walls. Shadow paced near the window. Something about the storm unsettled him. Daniel placed another log in the stove and sat down heavily on the cot. He had seen blizzards before, but this one felt different. The wind screamed outside for hours. The snow piled higher against the cabin until the lower windows disappeared behind white drifts. Ice crept along the edges of the water wheel, slowing its steady rotation. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The cold seeped through the cabin walls despite the stove's heat. Daniel woke suddenly. The dream had come again. Sand. Explosions. Men shouting in a language he barely remembered. His heart pounded as his eyes snapped open. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then Shadow's warm breath touched his hand. The dog stood beside the cot, watching him quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm here," he whispered. The dog remained still until Daniel's breathing calmed. Outside, the blizzard raged harder, but somewhere beyond the storm, another sound reached them, faint at first, then louder. Shadow's ears shot upright. The dog ran to the door and barked. Daniel stood instantly. "What is it?" Shadow barked again, scratching at the door. Shadow. And Daniel grabbed his coat and lantern. The moment he opened the door, the storm nearly tore it from his hands. Wind and snow slammed into the cabin like a wall. Shadow plunged into it without hesitation. Daniel followed. The trail toward town had vanished completely under deep snow, but Shadow seemed to know exactly where he was going. The dog ran ahead, stopping every few yards to make sure Daniel kept up. They struggled downhill through the blizzard for nearly 15 minutes. Then Daniel saw it. A faint lantern glow flickered through the storm. A small cabin stood crooked on the hillside below. The Parker family's house. The roof had collapsed. Half of it had caved in under the weight of snow. Daniel heard the sound next. Children crying. Shadow barked sharply and raced forward. Daniel forced the door open. Inside, snow blew through the broken roof beams, and two small children huddled beside their mother near the wall, while a man struggled to hold up a section of the collapsing ceiling with a wooden beam. The man looked up in shock. "Carter?" Daniel stepped inside quickly. "How bad?" The man shook his head. "Roof gave out. I can't hold it much longer." The beam above them creaked dangerously. Shadow moved immediately toward the children, standing close beside them, as if shielding them from the falling snow. Daniel examined the structure quickly. The main support had split. The entire roof could collapse any moment. "We're getting you out," Daniel said. "But the storm," the mother began. "We're not staying here." Daniel lifted one of the children into his arms. Shadow barked once and ran back toward the door. The dog turned and waited, leading them, guiding them through the storm. Outside, the wind howled louder than ever, but Shadow knew the path. And when for the first time since the storm began, Silver Creek's survival would depend on the man on the mountain and the dog who never stopped watching. The storm swallowed the world. Snow slashed sideways through the darkness, turning the narrow path between the trees into a shifting maze of white. Wind roared through the Bitterroot Mountains with a force that bent the tall pines until their branches groaned. Daniel Carter stepped out of the Parker cabin carrying the younger child in his arms. The boy clung to his coat, shaking from cold and fear. Behind him, Mrs. Parker wrapped a blanket around her daughter, while Mr. Parker struggled to pull the door shut against the rising wind. The roof creaked again behind them. Another beam cracked loudly. They had only seconds left. "Move," Daniel said. Shadow was already in the snow. The German shepherd ran ahead a few yards, and then stopped and looked back, waiting until Daniel stepped into the trail behind him. The dog barked once and started moving again. Through the storm, through the blinding snow, downhill toward the only safe place left in the mountains. Daniel's cabin. The wind pushed against them like a wall, Each step sank deep into fresh snow. The trail that once connected the hillside cabins to Silver Creek had disappeared entirely under the blizzard. But Shadow never hesitated. But he moved with confidence, nose low to the ground, remembering the path even when it could no longer be seen. Daniel followed. The child in his arms was trembling harder now. "It's okay," Daniel said quietly. "Almost there." Behind him, the Parker family struggled through the snow. Shadow barked again. A warning. Daniel looked up just in time to see a heavy pine branch snap under the weight of ice and crash into the trail ahead of them. Snow exploded upward as it hit, but the path was blocked. Daniel shifted the boy in his arms. Shadow ran forward, sniffing quickly around the fallen branch. Then the dog turned sharply and pushed through a narrow gap between two trees. A different route. Daniel followed without question. They climbed sideways across the slope, pushing through deep drifts while the storm howled around them. Shadow kept glancing back to make sure the group stayed together. Another 10 minutes passed. Then Daniel saw it, a faint light through the storm, the lantern inside his cabin. They reached the clearing moments later. The water wheel beside the stream was still turning slowly, despite the ice forming along its paddles. The steady movement of water kept part of the channel from freezing completely. Daniel kicked open the cabin door. Warm air rushed out from the small stove burning inside. "Get in," he said. The Parker family stumbled inside the moment he stepped aside. Shadow entered last. Daniel slammed the door shut against the storm and pushed a heavy wooden beam across it. For a moment, no one spoke. The cabin glowed with lantern light and the warm orange flicker of the stove. Steam rose from the Parker children's wet coats as they huddled near the fire. Mrs. Parker covered her mouth with trembling hands. I thought we were going to die out there." Daniel poured water into a small kettle and placed it over the stove. "You're safe now." Shadow lay down near the children, his large body radiating warmth. The younger boy reached out carefully and touched the dog's fur. Shadow didn't move away. Outside, the blizzard raged on. The storm had grown worse. Through the small window, Daniel could barely see the water wheel anymore. Snow had piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind screamed through the forest with relentless fury. Then Shadow's head lifted suddenly. The dog stood, and his ears turned toward the valley. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow barked sharply. Once, twice. Daniel stepped to the door and listened. At first, there was nothing but wind. Then another sound reached him. Voices, distant, shouting through the storm. Daniel opened the door carefully. Snow blasted into the cabin. Two figures stumbled into the clearing below, fighting their way through the wind. Lucas Bennett was one of them. The boy's face was red from the cold, yet his coat covered in ice. Beside him struggled Frank Doyle. The saloon owner looked nothing like the confident man who had laughed at the auction weeks earlier. Now his expression carried only fear. "Carter!" Lucas shouted over the wind. Daniel waved them forward. They rushed into the cabin, collapsing near the stove. Frank Doyle's hands shook violently as he pulled off his frozen gloves. "The town!" he gasped. Daniel waited. Frank looked up, breathing hard. "Roofs collapsing everywhere," he said. "Half the houses can't hold the snow." Lucas nodded. "The general store roof cracked," he added. "Mrs. Harper's trying to hold it up with beams." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "How many people still in town?" Frank swallowed. "Maybe 20, maybe more." The wind howled louder outside. Lucas looked at the water wheel through the frosted window. "That's all you built," the boy said slowly. Daniel understood immediately. The town had no lumber left. There's no strong boards to brace their roofs. No way to repair the houses before the storm buried them. Frank met Daniel's eyes. "We laughed at you," he said quietly. Daniel didn't respond. Shadow moved to stand beside him. The dog looked from the men to the storm outside, waiting. Daniel turned toward the door. Then let's get to work. Frank frowned. In this storm? Daniel grabbed his coat. Unless you want to nail snow to your roofs, Shadow barked once. The water wheel turned steadily beside the cabin. And for the first time since the storm began, the town of Silver Creek had a chance to survive. The wind outside the cabin howled like something alive. Snow slammed against the walls in thick waves, piling higher with every passing minute. The small clearing around Daniel Carter's cabin had almost disappeared beneath drifts that reached halfway up the windows. Inside, the air was warm but tense. Daniel moved quickly. He pulled on his heavy gloves and stepped toward the door again. Shadow rose instantly, tail low but alert, ready to follow. Frank Doyle stared at him. "You're serious," the saloon owner said. Daniel opened the door. The storm burst inside with a violent rush of snow. "We don't have time to argue," Daniel replied. Shadow stepped out first. The dog pushed into the blizzard without hesitation, his thick coat already dusted white. Daniel followed, leaning into the wind as he crossed the clearing toward the water wheel. Behind him, Frank and Lucas exchanged one uncertain look before pulling on their coats and stepping into the storm as well. The water wheel turned slowly beside the stream. Ice clung to the wooden paddles, but the rushing water still forced the wheel to rotate with a steady grinding rhythm. The saw blade attached to the frame moved back and forth across the cutting platform. Daniel brushed snow off the wooden carriage and grabbed a thick pine log stacked nearby. "Lift this," he said. Lucas hurried forward, helping guide the heavy log onto the cutting rails. Frank grabbed the other side. The three men pushed the log forward together until it reached the spinning blade. The metal teeth bit into the wood with a harsh screech. Fresh boards began sliding off the far side. Snow blew across the clearing while the sawmill roared into life. Shadow stood beside the cabin door, watching the forest and the trail leading down toward Silver Creek. The dog's ears twitched constantly. Even through the storm, he was listening for danger. Inside the cabin, Mrs. Parker wrapped blankets around the children while the kettle boiled on the stove. Through the small frosted window, she could see the faint glow of the lantern hanging beside the sawmill outside. Daniel's shadow moved steadily in the storm. The saw blade continued cutting, board after board. Outside, the work never stopped. Daniel fed log after log into the machine while Lucas stacked the finished lumber in piles beside the cabin wall. Frank Doyle struggled to keep up. The saloon owner's hands shook from cold and exhaustion. After nearly an hour, he leaned against the frame of the sawmill, breathing hard. "Carter!" he shouted over the storm. "This won't be enough!" Daniel pushed another log into the blade. "How many houses?" Frank wiped snow from his beard. "At least 8 with bad roofs." Daniel nodded once. "Then we cut enough for 8. The saw screamed again as another board slid free. Shadow suddenly barked. The sharp sound cut through the storm. Daniel looked up. The dog stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down the buried trail toward town. A faint shape moved through the blizzard, then another. Daniel stepped away from the saw. 2 figures stumbled into view moments later. Emily Harper and another man from town fought their way through the snowdrifts toward the cabin. Emily's coat was coated in ice, her hair frozen against her scarf. "Daniel!" she shouted. He hurried toward them. "What happened?" Emily struggled to catch her breath. "The general store roof is splitting," she said. "If it collapses, we lose everything inside." Frank stepped closer. "Oh, that store's the last place in town with food." Daniel glanced back toward the sawmill. "How long before it falls?" Emily shook her head. "Maybe an hour." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Lucas," he called. The boy looked up. "Start loading these boards onto the sled." Lucas nodded immediately. Frank grabbed the rope attached to a small wooden sled Daniel had built earlier in the winter. Within minutes, a stack of fresh lumber was tied down securely. The wind pushed harder as they prepared to leave. Shadow moved toward the sled. The dog sniffed the boards once, then turned and faced the trail downhill. Ready. Daniel tightened the rope around the sled harness. Let's move. The group pushed into the storm together. The sled slid behind them across the deep snow, while Shadow ran ahead, guiding them down the mountain path. The wind roared around the trees. Several times Daniel nearly lost sight of the trail completely. But Shadow never slowed. The dog followed the scent of town through the storm, as if the blizzard meant nothing to him. After nearly 20 minutes of fighting the wind, the lights of Silver Creek appeared faintly through the snow. The town looked battered. Drifts buried the streets. Half the roofs sagged dangerously under the weight of ice. A group of townspeople rushed forward when they saw Daniel and the sled of lumber. Hope spread across their faces instantly. Boards!" someone shouted. Daniel pointed toward the general store. "Roof first!" Men grabbed the lumber and hurried toward the building. Within minutes, hammers echoed through the storm as fresh planks were nailed across the cracked beams above the store. Snow continued to fall, but the roof held. Lucas climbed down from the ladder, breath steaming in the freezing air. "It's holding!" he shouted. A cheer rose from the small group gathered in the street, but for the first time since the storm began, fear loosened its grip on the town. Emily stepped beside Daniel, watching the reinforced roof. "You built that sawmill just in time," she said quietly. Daniel looked back toward the mountains where the faint shape of the water wheel turned in the distance. "I built it because winter always comes." Shadow sat beside him in the snow. The dog's fur was coated in ice crystals, but his eyes remained bright and watchful. Frank Doyle approached slowly. The saloon owner looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I was wrong about you." Daniel didn't answer. He simply turned back toward the mountain trail. Because the storm still raged, and many roofs in Silver Creek were still waiting to fall. The night that followed became the longest night Silver Creek had seen in years. Snow continued to fall in thick, blinding sheets. The wind never slowed. Yet every few minutes a heavy crack echoed somewhere across the small mountain town as another beam bent under the crushing weight of ice. But something had changed. The people of Silver Creek were no longer waiting for the storm to defeat them. They were moving. Lanterns flickered along the street as men and women carried fresh boards from Daniel Carter's sled to the houses that needed them most. Hammers struck wood through the freezing air while ladders leaned against sagging roofs. Lucas Bennett climbed up and down the ladder outside the Parker house with surprising speed for a boy his age. Frank Doyle shouted instructions from the ground while holding a lantern high enough for the men above him to see their work. Emily Harper stood in the doorway of her store, directing people to gather tools and nails. And through it all, Daniel Carter moved quietly from house to house, reinforcing beams and guiding the repairs. Shadow stayed close beside him. The German shepherd moved like a shadow through the drifting snow, watching every movement in the storm-dark streets. More than once, the dog barked suddenly, warning people when another heavy branch crashed down nearby or when the wind shifted violently across the roofs. By morning, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind slowed first. Then the snowfall faded to a thin, drifting curtain. The sky above Silver Creek slowly brightened into a pale gray dawn. Exhausted townspeople stood in the street looking around at what remained. Several roofs had collapsed, but many more had been saved. The general store still stood. The Parker house held. The small church on the edge of town had survived the storm with only minor damage. Frank Doyle leaned against the railing outside his saloon and stared toward the mountains. Daniel was already walking back toward the trail that led uphill. Shadow trotted beside him. "Carter!" Frank called, and Daniel stopped but didn't turn around. Frank walked forward through the deep snow. "You just saved half this town." Daniel finally glanced back. Frank rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Guess we were wrong about that cabin of yours. Daniel looked toward the mountains again. It's not the cabin. Frank frowned. What do you mean? Daniel nodded toward the faint sound of rushing water high above the valley. It's the river. Frank followed his gaze but saw nothing except the distant slope covered in snow. Daniel turned and continued up the mountain trail. Shadow followed. Behind them, the town slowly began to breathe again. The days that followed brought clear skies and brutal cold. Temperatures dropped below zero as the storm's aftermath settled across the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow remained piled high along the streets of Silver Creek, but the town had survived. When word of what had happened began to spread, freighters traveling through the region carried the story down the mountain roads. Ranchers from nearby valleys stopped in Silver Creek for supplies and heard about the man who had built a water-powered sawmill just weeks before the worst storm of the decade, and how that sawmill had saved the town. Daniel Carter did not visit town again for nearly a month. He stayed on the mountain. The water wheel continued turning beside his cabin every day, as its paddles pushing steadily through the icy stream, while the sawmill produced lumber that Daniel stacked carefully under a rough wooden shelter. Shadow remained his constant companion. The dog's shoulder wound healed slowly, leaving a faint scar hidden beneath his thick fur. Some mornings, Lucas Bennett climbed the trail to help Daniel work. The boy had begun learning how to shape beams and guide logs across the cutting platform. You could sell this lumber," Lucas said one afternoon while stacking boards. Daniel shook his head. "Town needs it more." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. But Silver Creek was not the only place paying attention. One morning in early spring, long after the snowstorms had ended, a black truck rolled slowly into the town square. Two men stepped out. They wore expensive coats and polished boots that had clearly never walked a mountain trail before, and Frank Doyle watched them through the window of his saloon. When the strangers asked about Daniel Carter, the entire room went quiet. "Up the mountain," Frank said finally. The men nodded. "Thought so." They drove away 20 minutes later, following the narrow road toward the forest. High above Silver Creek, Daniel Carter stood beside the water wheel when the truck finally appeared at the edge of the clearing. Shadow noticed it first. The German shepherd stepped forward, an ears sharp and body tense. The truck door opened. The two men climbed out, brushing snow from their coats. One of them smiled politely. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. The man walked closer. "My name is Robert Caldwell," he said. "My partner and I represent a small energy company based in Denver." Daniel wiped sawdust from his hands. "What do you want?" Caldwell glanced toward the turning water wheel. "We heard about what happened here this winter." His smile widened slightly. "Quite an impressive setup you've built." Daniel waited. Caldwell gestured toward the stream. "This water source, the elevation drop, the land around it." He paused. "We'd like to buy it." Shadow let out a low growl. Caldwell ignored the dog. "We're prepared to offer you $500,000 for the property," he continued. The clearing went quiet. The water wheel creaked softly as it turned beside the stream. Lucas stared at Daniel in shock. $500,000. More money than most people in Silver Creek would see in a lifetime. Caldwell spread his hands confidently. "You could start over anywhere you want." Daniel looked at the water flowing beneath the wheel. Then he looked down toward the valley where Silver Creek rested beneath the spring sun. Finally he spoke. "No." Caldwell blinked. I'm sorry?" Daniel met his eyes. "I'm not selling." The wind moved gently through the pine trees. Shadow stepped closer to Daniel's side. The investors looked at each other in confusion. They had expected negotiation, not refusal. Caldwell cleared his throat. "Perhaps you didn't hear the number correctly." Daniel shook his head. "I heard you." The water wheel continued turning. And for the first time since the storm, a new battle had quietly begun, while the two men from Denver stood silently in the clearing. The mountain air had grown warmer since the winter storms, but the snow still clung stubbornly to the shaded edges of the forest. The stream beside Daniel Carter's cabin ran faster now, swollen with early meltwater, and the wooden water wheel turned steadily with its familiar creaking rhythm. Robert Caldwell studied Daniel for a long moment. "You might want to think about it," he said calmly. "Oh, $500,000 is a generous offer for land like this." Daniel didn't answer. He simply walked back toward the sawmill frame and lifted another pine log onto the cutting rails. The metal blade screeched to life again. Lucas Bennett stood nearby, pretending to organize a stack of boards while watching the conversation carefully. Shadow remained beside Daniel. The German shepherd sat quietly but alert, his amber eyes never leaving the strangers. But Caldwell glanced toward the dog, then back at Daniel. "You built something impressive here," he continued. "With the right investment, we could build a small hydroelectric plant. Clean power. Jobs for the valley." Daniel pushed the log forward into the blade. Fresh boards slid off the cutting platform. "And the town?" Daniel asked. Caldwell hesitated slightly. "Well, the town would benefit from the economic growth, of course." Daniel shut down the saw. Yet the sudden silence filled the clearing. "What happens to the river?" he asked. Caldwell adjusted his coat. "It would be redirected slightly to increase power output." Daniel nodded slowly. "And the land?" "We would need the surrounding area," Caldwell admitted, "for safety regulations." Daniel wiped sawdust from his hands. "That includes Silver Creek." Caldwell didn't answer immediately. That silence told Daniel everything he needed to know. Shadow stood up. The dog's low growl vibrated in his chest. Caldwell cleared his throat. "You're a practical man, Mr. Carter. Surely you understand that places like this don't last forever." Daniel looked down toward the valley. Silver Creek sat peacefully beneath the early spring sun. Smoke rose again from several chimneys. Children played near the general store. Life had returned. "This place already survived once," Daniel said quietly. Caldwell sighed. "Oh, we'll give you time to reconsider." The two men returned to their truck. A moment later, the engine started, and the vehicle disappeared down the narrow road toward town. The clearing grew quiet again. Only the steady sound of the water wheel remained. Lucas finally stepped closer. $500,000, the boy said softly. Daniel lifted another log onto the cutting platform. "That's a lot of money." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Lucas hesitated. "Lucas, why didn't you take it?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the river for a long moment. The current flowed around rocks that had probably been sitting there for centuries. Shadow walked over and sat beside him. The dog leaned gently against Daniel's leg. Lucas waited. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Because money doesn't fix everything." Lucas frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned against the sawmill frame. For the first time since the boy had met him, Daniel's voice carried a different tone. Not quiet, not distant, but tired. "Years ago," Daniel began slowly, "I was part of a convoy moving through the mountains in Afghanistan." Lucas listened carefully. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the forest. "There were 12 of us," he continued. "We'd been out there for days. Cold nights, thin air, roads barely wide enough for the trucks." He paused. "The storm came faster than anyone expected." Lucas remained silent. Daniel's voice softened. The road collapsed in the dark. One truck slid off the edge. His hands tightened slightly around the edge of the sawmill frame. Then another. The sound of the river filled the silence. "We weren't prepared," Daniel said quietly. "Not enough supplies. Not enough shelter." Lucas looked down. "How many made it out?" he asked carefully. Daniel didn't answer for several seconds. "3." The boy swallowed. Shadow lifted his head and rested it gently against Daniel's knee, while Daniel scratched behind the dog's ear. "He was the only one who didn't leave after that," Daniel said. Lucas looked at Shadow. "You mean he was there?" Daniel nodded. "He was part of a search unit back then." Lucas stared at the German shepherd with new respect. "He found us," Daniel said softly. "In the snow." Shadow's tail moved once. Daniel's voice lowered even further. "I've spent years thinking about what I could have done differently," he continued. "Oh, if I had built better shelter. If we had prepared for the storm." The river rushed past the water wheel. "So you built this," Lucas said. Daniel nodded. "The mountains always win if you don't respect them." Lucas looked down toward Silver Creek. "And the town?" Daniel followed his gaze. "People deserve a second chance." The water wheel continued turning beside the cabin. The sawmill stood ready for the next log, and beside Daniel Carter, the dog who had once pulled him from the snow remained exactly where he had always been, watching, waiting, loyal to the man who refused to leave the mountains behind. Spring came slowly to the Bitterroot Mountains. The last walls of snow melted away from the slopes above Silver Creek, feeding the stream that ran beside Daniel Carter's cabin. Day by day, the water rose higher and moved faster, turning the wooden wheel with steady strength. The wheel had become a familiar sound now, a deep, rhythmic creak that echoed through the clearing like a quiet heartbeat. Shadow lay beside the cabin porch, watching the forest as sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees. His muzzle had begun to gray slightly with age, but his eyes were still sharp and bright. Daniel stepped out of the cabin carrying a cup of coffee. The morning air smelled of wet earth and pine. Below the mountain, Silver Creek was no longer the silent town it had been during the winter. Much of smoke rose from chimneys again. The general store door opened early each morning, and on several pieces of land along the valley floor, small farms had begun to appear. The storm that had nearly buried the town had also done something unexpected. It had convinced people to stay. Lucas Bennett climbed the path that morning with a bundle of mail tucked under his arm. He was taller now than when he first came to help Daniel months ago. Shadow lifted his head as the boy approached. "Morning. Oh, Shadow," Lucas said. The dog wagged his tail once. Lucas reached the clearing and handed Daniel an envelope. "From Denver again." Daniel studied the envelope quietly. The same company had sent several letters since that day on the mountain. Each offer had been larger than the last. Daniel opened the envelope slowly. Lucas waited. After a moment, Daniel folded the letter again and slipped it back inside. "Well?" Lucas asked. Daniel handed the envelope to him. Lucas read the number printed on the page, and his eyes widened. They doubled the offer. Daniel leaned against the cabin railing and looked out toward the valley. Lucas lowered the paper. "You still not selling?" Daniel shook his head. The boy looked down toward Silver Creek. The town had changed. New wooden beams strengthened the houses that once stood weak and abandoned. Fresh lumber from Daniel's sawmill had been used to repair roofs, build sheds, and even raise a small new barn at the edge of the valley. The stream that powered the sawmill also fed irrigation channels that several families had started using for crops. Silver Creek was breathing again. "Guess they don't understand this place, though," Lucas said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Most people don't." Shadow stood and stretched slowly. The dog walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down toward the valley as he often did. From that high ridge, the entire town could be seen. When children ran through the dirt road near the general store, a wagon rolled slowly past the church. Someone hammered boards onto the side of a new building near the river. Life. Lucas followed Shadow's gaze. Remember the day you bought this place? He asked. Daniel chuckled quietly. Hard to forget. They all laughed. Daniel nodded. Yes. Lucas looked around the clearing. The cabin was no longer the collapsing ruin that had once stood here. The roof was strong, and the walls were straight. The sawmill frame stood solid beside the stream, and stacks of lumber waited beneath a large wooden shelter. Even the water wheel had been rebuilt with thicker paddles and stronger supports. What made you buy it? Lucas asked. Daniel walked toward the stream. The water rushed beneath the wheel with a steady roar now that spring runoff had arrived. He watched the current for a moment before answering. After the war, he said slowly. Oh, I tried living in cities. Lucas listened quietly. Too much noise, Daniel continued. Too many people who didn't understand silence. Shadow walked over and sat beside him. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's neck. The mountains are honest, he said. Lucas frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel pointed toward the peaks rising beyond the valley. They don't promise anything, he said. They just tell you the truth. The wind moved gently through the tall trees. You respect them, or you don't survive. Lucas looked down at the town again. And Silver Creek? Daniel smiled. That town remembered. They stood quietly for a while. The water wheel turned beside them. Shadow eventually lay down near the stream, resting his head on his paws. Time passed. Years, in fact. The small farms below Silver Creek grew larger. More families arrived in the valley. The sawmill continued turning through every season, supplying wood for homes, barns, fences, bridges. Daniel Carter grew older. His hair turned gray, and the lines on his face deepened under the mountain sun. Shadow slowed down too. The once tireless German shepherd now preferred resting beside the porch during long afternoons, watching the valley with calm patience. One autumn evening many years later, a small group of children climbed the trail toward the cabin. They had heard the story. Everyone in Silver Creek knew it, and they gathered around the old man sitting beside the water wheel. One of the children finally asked the question they had all been waiting to ask. Mr. Carter, why did you buy this broken cabin when everyone else thought it was worthless? Daniel looked at the turning water wheel. The stream flowed beneath a thin layer of forming ice as winter began returning to the mountains. He glanced toward Shadow lying beside his boots. The old dog lifted his head slightly. Then Daniel looked out across the valley where the town lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky. Because when everything else leaves, Daniel said quietly, the mountains stay. The children followed his gaze. Below them, Silver Creek was alive. Smoke curled from chimneys. Lanterns glowed along the street. And far above it all, beside the steady river that never stopped flowing, the old cabin stood strong against the mountains. The water wheel continued to turn, and beside Daniel Carter. Shadow kept watching. If this story moved you even a little, let me know you're here. Just type 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty like Shadow's still exists in the world. Or type 0 if you think towns like Silver Creek are slowly disappearing. I read every comment, and I always want to know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet strength of veterans and their dogs, let's make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting. And trust me, the mountains still have many stories left to tell.